Want me to put more bad music on? I have lots to choose from.
Well, actually, I have nothing to complain about anymore. That music was fantastic.
Oh, yeah? I have something to complain about. It was like turning on the radio, like top 40 radio in the 90s. That's not an attractive thing.
All right, so how about that iPad Pro?
Yeah, I put that in there just to make a second run at this, because after the last show where we talked about this in the after show and hearing it back, I'm not sure I successfully communicate what I was trying to say. It was when I listened to myself, I don't think if I didn't already know what I was thinking, I would have understood myself. So I thought I'd start by asking you two to see if you can summarize what I was trying to say about the iPad Pro, and then when you fail to say what is in my head, I will try to clarify.
Wow. Dude, that happened like a week ago. I don't remember what you said. Come on.
I have some idea.
Give it a shot. Like, what was it? Like, you were asking, like, why does anyone ever want an iPad Pro? And I tried to give you the reason why I think a larger, more capable iPad is an inevitable thing that will happen someday. I tried to explain why.
I think your reasoning for why it had to be larger was that like as the OS gets more advanced and allows more advanced types of usage, that you will have to at some point have some kind of multiple window kind of arrangement, or the possibility for multiple windows, whether it's split or whether it's like a fixed setup or a flexible setup. But so it was something. It was mainly about it has to get bigger because it will get more advanced, and more advanced needs more window space. Was that the gist?
That was like the secondary thing we ended up talking about, but the main thing, I think I'll take another shot at it here. The main thing I was trying to get at was what I have in the show notes here, but it's the better for people metric. And we got back to it. We circled around back to it a little bit at the end, but I was thinking of it in terms of like in the DOS days before the graphical user interface, when the graphical user interface came along, it was clear that GUIs are better for people, meaning that, yeah, the command line with Unix and DOS and all the things that preceded is good and powerful, and you can get stuff done, and a lot of people can use it. But overall, you look at the GUI, you look at the command line, you say, the GUI is better for people to use. More people are going to be able to successfully use a computer with the GUI. It's more pleasant to use. It's like easier. And yeah, maybe you guys didn't live through this because you don't remember the debates, but there were real debates about whether this whole GUI thing is a useful idea at all, or whether it's just some silly diversion.
What do you mean we didn't live through this? I lived through this.
Well, you were very young, and maybe you were still fighting though. But
we were alive.
Yeah, you were alive, but
we were also in preschool.
Well, no, that's not true. I mean, well, okay.
1984.
Well, no, in 1984 we were barely human, but I mean, if you consider that both of us were PC guys, we were around, or at least I was using computers before Windows had really become a thing. And I remember using Windows 3.1 and thinking it was a piece of crap because, well, it was a piece of crap. And I remember slinging AutoExec.bat files like you couldn't even imagine, and config sys files to figure out for which game I needed a mouse and which didn't, and so on and so forth. We don't need to turn this into another retro podcast. I'm just saying I was around for the transition in my own way. Maybe not on an industry level, but on a personal level.
When you were that age, though, you probably weren't thinking about what the GUI means for the future of the industry. Like that, on that type of level. The people who were writing articles in magazines about whether this was a good idea or not. But in hindsight, it's so clear. GUIs are better for people, right? And there was a big debate about it, and it took a long time, and eventually all computers said, all computers are GUIs. Now, no, they're not. I've got a command line on my Mac. It's like, no, the GUI, the GUI took over because it's better for people to use, right? iOS, I think of in relation to the regular Windows mouse pointer menus, WIMP, type interface. I think of iOS as not as big a step from a command line to the GUI, certainly not, but as another sort of discontinuity in that type of thing. iOS and that type of touch interface is better for people than having a mouse and windows and menu bars and right-clicking and docks and task bars and all the stuff that regular Windows type interfaces or Mac type interfaces use today. iOS is better for people. You see it yourself in like how much more willing people are to use iPads and iPhones and all these technology devices that people use that same people would be much more intimidated by like a quote-unquote real computer with a GUI. And again, doesn't mean that the traditional Windows menu pointer interface is going away, or that, like we still have the command line today. We'll have GUIs, for a similar period of time. But in general, the iOS interface, touch interfaces, are better for people. All right, and when I see that, that makes me think there's no fighting against the interface that's better for people. Like, it will eventually become the most common way that people use computers, if it isn't already, if you count like smartphones as computers and everything, right? And when I see that, I think it can't be the thing that most people use for computing and remain as limited as it is now. Because otherwise, you know how many people today continue to have to use computers because they can't get what they want to get done on this new thing. And so my logic is the thing that's better for people to use is here. It's not quite good enough or capable enough to subsume enough of the functionality of other things. Just like when Windows 3.1 sucked, you couldn't do anything. The things that you can do on DOS or Unix command line were not even close to being possible on a GUI. But eventually, the GUI became good enough and subsumed enough of the functionality of the command line that the command line was relegated to a very small window. And in the same operating system, it's there, it's here, we can use it when we want to. It's important for developers and stuff like that, but a regular person who buys a Mac does not use the command line, and someday that'll be true of iOS. A regular person who buys an iOS device doesn't have to use a Windows mouse pointer GUI. So it's just that simple logical progression. If that's going to be the progression, it's silly to think that this next thing that's better for people won't have to become more capable and take on the mantle of the thing that it's replacing in some respects. So that's what I was trying to get at. And you can disagree with it. You could say, well, I don't think iOS is better enough, or I don't think iOS is really better for people, or I think iOS will not have to take on any of the capabilities of the Mac, and the Mac will stay exactly the way it is, and iOS will just go off into the future, and it does enough for people as it is. But I see all the people who use a Mac every day, and I'm like, that's not, the number of people who use a command line every day is really small. The number of people who use a Mac every day is humongous. Those people will want to move to the thing that's better for people, to the iOS-style touch interface, eventually, if that device becomes capable enough for them to do their work on it. How many of those people can you bring along? How many people have to be stuck using a Mac? Well, it's probably similar to the proportion of people who are stuck using a command line. I use a command line every day. Certain professions and contexts will require the use of a plain old GUI the same way they require the use of a command line today. But there's tons and tons more people who use a Mac who never use a command line, and those people will be using something like a tablet-type form factor that's much bigger and more capable many years in the future when it becomes possible to do so.
So let me play devil's advocate for a second. So everything you just said, which sounds reasonable, but everything you just said is based upon an implied or stated assumption that the way that we have touch interfaces and tablets now is better for people than the desktop and Windows and everything else. What if that's not the case? So here's some things to consider. So first of all, there's a few things about it that are worse. I think we can pretty much all look around regular people and us, and we can see that text input is definitely worse on tablets than on laptops.
I don't include that at all, because there's no reason that you wouldn't have a hardware keyboard.
Well,
you know
okay, so
like what I'm talking about mainly is like a menu bar, windows with little window widgets on, sliding them around on the screen, clicking and right clicking, having a mouse instead of a finger, like that. All of that is what I'm getting at. The text input is a artifact of the form factor. You know what I mean? Like the small tablet that you expect to carry with you versus something that would sit at your desk. Again, I'm not saying people are going to have tablets and be walking around with them. If you are in design or some field where you're going to be using this future thing, I envision you having something as big as your monitor, but like laid down like on an architect's drafting table with like a keyboard in front of it or something, so that you can get your work done in that context.
Well, okay, so let's say this comes true. Let's say you have a keyboard. The text input is solved for you. You have easy ways to reach the interface from the keyboard in some kind of relatively ergonomic way. So, it wouldn't be like a tablet on a stand and having to reach your hand up and touch the screen constantly. So you have to address that somehow, some kind of like precision pointing of some sort, more precision than a finger. Whether that's a pen, whether it's a mouse, whether it's a touchpad kind of thing, whether it's just a giant touchscreen so the touch targets are small enough, relatively speaking, that they can be precise. Who knows? But
it would have to be a stylus, I would imagine, because I'm thinking in creative fields, people are already using styluses, so that's not even that big of a change.
Right. Okay. So, and I actually enjoy the experience of using a pen, although I don't use one regularly, but because I enjoy a mouse more. But I think a stylus is a perfectly fine solution to that, out of everything that we have. So let's say you've added all this. You have advanced ways for people to get more work done. What if the reason why there's this idea out there in people's heads that the iPad and everything is easier for people? What if the reason why is because it can't support all that stuff? It can't do complicated workflows and much multitasking to speak of and all this other stuff. And then what if the process of adding those things to enable people to, quote, get more work done on iOS makes it more like traditional PCs and therefore removes that whole advantage that it supposedly had by being so much easier? And is it possible to add all those things without having that side effect? And I'm not sure it is.
Yeah, it's the closeness of, I was saying the gap between the GUI and the Mac is huge, and the gap between the Mac and iOS is much smaller, but I still think it's significant enough. And in the case of the command line to the GUI, it was almost not possible to bring over enough command line stuff to negate the advantage of the GUI. I mean, Windows tried by basing it on DOS and by having you boot into DOS and having so many things still involving DOS and having DOS underpin the thing for so long and having it in your face and exposed to you. But that wasn't enough to kill the GUI. If you wanted to kill iOS, you could do that by bringing over all the bad things from the Mac. But I think that you don't need to bring over too many complexities from the Mac to make iOS more capable. And I don't think anyone would make the crazy mistake of bringing over the worst things about the Mac. Like, I don't think anyone would ever say, I've got an idea. Why don't we have a bunch of windows on our iPad screen with tiny little widgets in the corner? Because if you've ever seen anyone deal with a bunch of overlapping windows, it's just too much. Why don't we bring over the file system? Because we know how well people deal with navigating through folders and files. Why don't we just have a big file system that we expose on the iPad? Again, I don't think that would ruin it. You're right. But I don't think anyone would do that. Or at least I don't think Apple would do it. Maybe Android would do it. Maybe they already have it. I don't know about Android. It is possible to ruin it because it is close enough. It's a close enough neighbor. It's not some like a big, or for example, bring over a mouse pointer and make you use a mouse pointer for everything. And then all of a sudden things aren't responsive to touch controls because it's hard to use this app because they expect you to have a mouse pointer to work with the little window widgets or whatever. I don't think that Apple, at least, would be dumb enough to bring over this. And if anything, Apple has been very reticent to bring over any of the more powerful things, and they're bringing over very, very slowly. And there's just no way they would bring over those horrible things. And then most of the horrible things I'm thinking about are things people don't want to deal with, installing printer drivers is like a thing from, the ancient world. But Apple kind of already addressed that with AirPrint, saying we're not doing the printer driver thing anymore. It's your problem. We're going to tell you how we're going to speak. You better deal with it. Which is one way to get rid of printer drivers. And the file system, I don't think Apple's going to be bringing that back. Dealing with apps the old way, I don't think that's coming back. I think the new way is better. Dealing with Windows, Apple has to come up with something, but I don't think they would bring over plain old Windows because that would be pretty stupid. So it's possible to ruin it, perhaps, unlike it is in the GUI's case, from the GUI to the command line, but I think it's unlikely that they'll ruin it. And as I said last show, the other alternative is rather than making iOS more capable, why don't you make the Mac simpler? And I think it's easier to make iOS more capable than it is to make the Mac simpler, especially since a lot of the complexities the Mac have to live on because some people will always need them the same way some people will always need the command line.
Well, but they are making the Mac simpler. I mean, isn't that what things like Gatekeeper and Launch Center Pad thing, whatever you call it, isn't that what that's all about?
But you can't get rid of the overlapping windows.
Well, you can run an app full screen.
Yeah, but that just adds complexity, as we talked about last time. Now you have yet another mode that you have to worry about. If you've seen people deal with Windows, adding full screen doesn't help them because now they're trapped in some mode they don't understand. It's very difficult to take away complexity from the Mac to even get it to the close to the level of friendliness that iOS has. Whereas if you add capabilities to iOS, it can remain friendly to the people who don't want those advanced abilities in the same way that if you don't want to enable the multitasking gestures, that doesn't bother any people. If you don't know how to get to the multitasking switcher, you can just hit the home button and go back to the home screen every time. It still works for you in that simple mode. They've added capability without adding complexity. I mean, I'm thinking long term. Like this gets tied up in. That's the other thing I think people are about. It gets tied up in like, will Apple announce an iPad with Pro at the end of its name this year, and it'll be bigger? Like, who knows? Who cares? Like, it's not what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about an upcoming imminent product or Apple's plans for the next year or two, or what iOS 8 is going to be. I'm thinking long term, and you're right, Marco. The entire thing is based on the premise that iOS is better for people, and it's inevitable that many, many more people who currently can't use iOS or anything like iOS to do their job will have to be served by this better thing. Like that's the tide that's coming, because if there's a thing out there that's better for people, and people use it all the time, and I think most people would agree that using their phone or their iPad is better, they'll want to use that to do more stuff, and if they can't, they'll want more capability out of it.
Another assumption that might be worth questioning is whether iOS's simplicity today is overall easier for people, because as we discussed last episode with the storage limits, and when people hit their storage limits, and it's kind of crappy to figure out where that's going and how to recover from that. iOS's simplicity a lot of times will create the question in people's minds of, how do I do this? Or how do I fix this limitation? And a lot of times the answer is you can't. Or it's so complicated that it's not even worth doing. Like simple things that on a computer might be accomplished by drag and drop, or by hitting the open dialog button in an app to open a file from somewhere else, from some other app. Stuff like that people, attaching files to emails, stuff that people generally know how to do on computers, after not that much usage. A lot of those kinds of things are still even more complicated on iOS than they are on a computer, because of its design and because of its limitations.
You think more people would be more successful at attaching a file to an email using a Mac than they would doing that same thing in iOS?
Definitely, no question.
No, I don't think that's the case.
Because in iOS, you can't do it from the email.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's the way people think about it. Like, just because that's the way it works in desktop mail application, we're used to it. I think people are just as likely to, holding down your finger on a picture is not great, but I think they're just as likely to figure out the holding down your finger on a picture or hitting the little share icon. I mean, it's not completely intuitive, but I think they're just as likely to come to it from that direction. And the main problem with attaching an email on the Mac is drag and drop. Forget it. It doesn't even occur to people that you can drag a little picture onto I think that's outside the realm of most people's experience. But they do know how to click the little paperclip icon. And when they click the little paperclip icon in whatever their mail application is, they get an open save dialog box. And then you're just off in the weeds, and it's like 50-50 whether anyone's going to know what the hell to do with that. And they'll just maybe hope that they know how to click on the thing that takes them to their desktop, and they'll find the file on their desktop, which is where all their files are, because it's the one place in the file system they can use. The running out of space, I think, is another thing where it's like there are limits. There are hardware limits to any piece of hardware. And when you run into those limits, at that point, that's when the reality of the computer smacks the user in the face, and you can't do anything to protect them from it. You don't have infinite space on your device. Maybe some super clever cloud thing in the future could make it appear as if you have infinite space, but you don't have infinite. Like, it's kind of like how multitasking makes it seem like you have infinite memory. They're trying to, they're never going to say, "Oh, you're out of memory. Please quit some applications so you can launch some more." Well, the combination of virtual memory and the expunging stuff is an iOS simplification that makes people not have to worry about whether an application is running or not, or at least try to worry less about it. But when you run out of space, have you ever seen anyone run out of space on the Mac? First of all, the Mac OS X behaves very, very badly when you're out of disk space. Extremely badly. Freaky things happen. It's very easy to get into a situation where the OS can't create another swap file, and it seems like your entire OS is frozen. And you get those warning dialog boxes before that. The OS will warn you, "Oh, running out of space." What do people do about that? Like, best case scenario, they randomly start trying to drag things to the trash. That's best case. And like, if you've seen people, this library folder, I don't need that, do I? Like, that's the way they made it invisible. Like, God forbid they get into that library folder and start going to their preferences folder, or like, I don't understand what this is, I'm throwing that out. Application support? My applications don't need any support. That's best case. At least iOS protects them from doing that. But you run into those hardware limits. That's one of the hardest problems. What do I do when all of the space for stuff is filled with stuff, whether that be memory or flash space or whatever?
To go back a step, I almost think that the attachment thing is a example of the iPad, or I guess I should say iOS in general, getting a little more strong is a poor choice of words, a little better for power users. And that's because, Marco had said, well, there's no way to attach something from an email. And you actually can. If you get the little context menu up, and there may be a different term for that on iOS, but the little black pop-up menu, if you go like 35 levels deep in that, past bold, italics, underline, and all that, you can actually insert picture or video, I believe is the terminology used.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
I knew you could copy and paste, but there's actually like a button there to proactively do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Exactly. And that only came in the last one or two versions of iOS. I don't recall exactly when it was.
Don't you think people who like grew up on smartphones, though, it's more natural for them to start from the picture that they want to send to somebody and then say, okay, send this picture to Sue, instead of start from the email application, compose a message to Sue, and then insert the picture? Like, that's totally a desktop computer user's mindset, I think.
It absolutely is. And as someone who grew up on a desktop computer, that is what up until whenever it was in iOS that they added this feature, every time I wanted to send a picture to someone, I'm just hardwired to start an email, send it to Aaron, let's say, and then crap, I got to start from photos. And then I got to leave my email, start from photos, and then I've lost my email that I've written unless I copy and paste, et cetera, et cetera. And so once I discovered that you can actually kick off the picture and video chooser from within an email, that actually helped me a lot because I'm so hardwired. That's my internal mental workflow, is to start the email and then go get the attachment.
I think the most likely scenario for what I just described about the iPad Pro not coming to pass is that it turns out that for the people who are currently using Macs and Mac-like systems to get their work done, iOS, the advantages of iOS are not compelling enough to make them leave behind all the things that annoy them. Like that they would prefer to use iOS. They do prefer sitting on the couch with their iPad and like browsing through the web in their off time or whatever. But all of the things that annoy them about the Mac and multiple windows and dealing with multiple applications and dealing with the little fidgety things that you don't have to deal with in iOS don't annoy them enough to be willing to put up with what is the inevitable transition period when iOS is not quite capable enough. And like there's going to be that middle period where like who's going to be the first person to try to get their work done in iOS? And you kind of see it now with the people bravely trying to use an iPad when they should just be using a MacBook Air just for the novelty factor of it. But that's on a very small scale. On a larger scale, you need to get the people who are using their computers like they did for the GUI, people who are using their computers for real work. There were some people who had to say, I'm actually going to try this Windows thing or this Mac thing, even though I'm not even sure how I'm going to be able to get my job done because I do everything in, VisiCalc, and VisiCalc isn't available, and I'll try this new Excel thing, and maybe that'll work out. I'm not sure. So that transition period could prevent iOS-type interfaces from taking the mantle of the personal computer in our lifetime. That I think is the most likely scenario for it not happening.
I can't help but wonder if the three of us are participating in one long troll of Viticci in this topic.
He's like an outlier, I would say. If you were like, make your living right about technology, those are the people who keep trying to do it. Like, I'll see what it's like to do my work on. Do I need a laptop? I'm going to leave the house without a laptop and just take my iPad and see how it goes. And we're all trying that experiment to varying degrees. If you have a laptop and an iPad, sometimes you might just take the iPad to see how that goes, and you learn whether it works for you or not and why it doesn't or does. But I'm thinking of all the people who just spend all day at work in front of a computer, and that computer is not running iOS or Android. It's running Windows or OS X.
Right. Hey, Marco, what's cool these days?
We got some new ones this week. Our first sponsor is HelpSpot. Go to helpspot.com/ATP. So if you're still using email clients for customer support, you're probably losing track of important tickets. Or, you're trying to do these weird hacks like using mark as unread to like keep something new because you haven't responded to it yet. Or you're IMing your coworkers to see who's working on what message in the big inbox. This is all really, that doesn't scale very well. It's time for you to get organized with HelpSpot, of course. So most help desk apps try to be all things to all people. They pile on tons of features, tons of all these complicated things. HelpSpot is focused. It deals only with customer inquiries and self-serve knowledge bases. There's no like crazy asset management systems or API integrations with your account systems or other unnecessary features to get in your way or require complex integrations. Help desk software is usually really expensive. It's usually around $600 per user per year. HelpSpot is just $299 per user one time, not per year, not per month, just $299 per user one time. You got it for life. And with HelpSpot, there's no lock-in. You can download it and host it yourself on your own servers if you want to, or you can have it hosted for you. Either way, you always have access to the database to directly query it or dump it out and take it elsewhere. And HelpSpot, they've been around for a long time. It isn't just like some bleeding edge startup that just started yesterday. They've been around for nearly a decade, and it's been adopted by thousands of companies and organizations. Customers from single-person startups to Fortune 500 companies use HelpSpot to manage their support teams. So start your free trial today at helpspot.com/ATP. Remember how I said it was a good deal earlier? You can get an even better deal by using coupon code ATP14, that's ATP14 when you purchase, to get $100 off. So thanks a lot to HelpSpot. Go to helpspot.com/ATP. And don't forget to use coupon code ATP14 for $100 off.
You know, I have to say that somebody in the chat had already disappeared. Oh, Sewelpeen? I don't know, whatever. Anyway, they said Macs will be ARM within the next 5 years. It's logically next. And as someone who relies on a Windows VM in order to get their job done on a Mac, I surely hope not. Or I hope that I switch my career into a different segment, because if unless I'm missing something, if Macs go ARM, that's going to make virtualizing x86 really stinky, just like it used to be before Macs were Intel.
Oh, ARM just came out with their new server platform, and they're sort of defining the platform for ARM in the data center and trying to make a common platform for ARM style, personal computers, more or less. I don't think that, if you wait long enough, in theory, if the ARM destroys everything comes to pass, then the Mac could be the last thing to switch to ARM. And by that point, everything is running ARM, and the data set is running ARM, and all your servers are running ARM, and personal computers are running ARM, and then the Mac's running ARM. So then you'd be virtualizing like Linux on ARM and Windows on ARM inside your virtual machine on ARM, and everything would work out. But yeah, you don't want to be the first one to go there and have everybody else still on x86, and then you lose your ability to do that virtualization.
Right.
I mean, I think, what do I virtualize? Well, I virtualize Windows because I have to for stupid work things, because they still use Windows, and that is actually a legitimate concern about like the future of computing, because Apple doesn't want that business. The business being selling your company like their mail server and stuff. Google kind of wants it. They want them to use like Google Apps, but it's such a difference between having your own software than doing everything through the cloud, especially Google's cloud, that I'm not even sure that's a good fit. So if Google isn't a good fit for that business, and Apple doesn't want that business, who gets that business? And if the answer is Microsoft keeps it forever, then yeah, maybe we'll forever be stuck running Windows in a VM so we can use our Works mail thing, because I don't know.
Yeah, but that would be so much slower, I got to imagine. Like, I remember, even as a non-Mac person, I remember many, many, many years ago that you could get some sort of card that was basically a PC on an expansion card, and you could virtualize within OS 7, 8, 9, I don't even know, by using this PC on an expansion card. You would know more about this. Do you know what I'm thinking of?
Yep, they're like a 486 on a card they had them for the Mac LC even, so you could run like Windows software on your education computers inside your school. Yeah, I know the cards you're talking about. The better analogy for you is like Virtual PC, which was you would emulate x86 on the PowerPC, and it would barely sort of run, but it was super slow, and that's why my lovely Mac Pro is a dream machine. It runs everything natively.
Yeah.
Unix, Mac, and Windows.
One of the reasons why the Intel switch was so easy for Mac owners, for the most part, is because switching to Intel came with a massive performance boost also. And so when combined with the awesome emulation by Rosetta, it was almost penalty-free to emulate stuff on Intel that was made for PowerPC. If we went to ARM, though, we wouldn't have that kind of headroom in all likelihood. We would probably be taking a step down in CPU performance at that point. And so it would be really inconvenient to have an architecture change that did not come with a giant performance boost also, where you'd have to emulate this stuff to some degree if you wanted to run it, and it would not be pretty.
If you wanted the big boost, like the reason Apple got the big boost for going x86 is two things. One, their past CPU vendor stopped making them good CPUs. So like they were stuck with the GeForce and the PowerBooks because IBM wouldn't make anything better to go in there. And even on the G5, IBM's, Steve said they were going to give us 3 gigahertz in a year or whatever. Whether IBM said that or not, they sure as hell didn't. And we were stuck with the G5 for way too long, and it wasn't improving better. So you have to have the CPU you're on stagnate. And it doesn't seem like that's going to happen if we stay on x86. Will there be a period when x86 stagnates? Doesn't seem like that's anywhere in the near future. And the second thing is that not only did the CPU Apple was on stagnate, the CPU they moved to got out of a rut because the CPU they were going to move to was like in the NetBurst architecture that was crap, and Apple was sold on x86 by Intel, showing them, look, here's the core architecture, and trust us, it's going to be awesome. And lo and behold, the core architecture was awesome. So that's a combination of two factors that almost certainly is not going to exist again, where the CPU Apple is using stagnates and gets crappy, and the CPU they're going to jump to makes a huge leap over where it was. Because it's not like Apple switched from, the awesome newly introduced PowerPC G5 to the Pentium 4. Like, that would not have given them a giant boost in performance. The G5 was reasonably competitive with its contemporaries, but when they did make the switch, you're right, they were able to hide the Rosetta thing underneath the carpet of this two-sided advantage to make it so that they could do PowerPC software emulated at a reasonable speed.
So let me ask you both, and I have a feeling that you two are a poor audience for this question, but would you trade a somewhat significant hit in performance, especially when virtualized? Let's assume that non-virtualized performance is roughly on par, but virtualized performance is crummy. Would you trade that in favor of dramatically improved battery life? And I'm making this up, but ARM tends to be a little bit more power frugal. So let's say that a Phantom MacBook Air that runs on ARM has twice the battery life of whatever the modern Intel MacBook Air's battery life is.
So 30 hours instead of 15?
Well, no, seriously. I mean, let's just suppose, as a fun thought experiment, would you make that trade even if Windows virtualization or anything, x86 virtualization is crummy? I mean, let's start with you, John.
I don't think that's a hypothetical scenario that would never come to pass, because I don't believe that ARM can equal the performance of Intel and offer double the power efficiency.
And that's fair.
And even if ARM was fabbed by Intel, I don't think it'd do that. It's not as if Intel has a easy doubling of, it's like x86 is worth, it's killing your performance. So if you get twice the performance, the overhead of x86, as crummy as it is not, a 50% reduction. So I don't think that would ever happen. And I also think that Intel is already good enough that, like, once you get your battery life into the long enough to last for the entire waking time of a human, 15-hour battery life on a MacBook Air. Granted, they're not Retina yet, and it's going to take a hit when they grow Retina. But I think Intel is already in the ballpark, so I don't think that will ever be offered. And if they did offer it, I personally wouldn't take it, because my calculus would be battery life is already all day long enough, and it's only going to get better by small increments. Give me the speed, please. You know what I'm like with speed. I want the fastest thing. So I would not personally take that, and I also don't think they could ever offer that.
And that's fair. What about you, Marco?
Well, first, I think it's hilarious that you're asking this to two people who not only want speed, but hardly ever use laptops.
That's exactly why I knew this audience was not the right audience. But nevertheless, indulge me.
All right. So, for me, I mostly agree with John. I think, I wouldn't be that excited about such a product because I'm not currently having battery life laptop issues. The modern laptops, especially if I'm going to go buy a new one, the new ones have even better battery life than the ones I've had before. And so, even the new Intel ones are really just awesome, and they're just only going to get better as we go through more process shrinks and more like circuit shutoff technology steps and stuff like that. It's only going to get better. So it's not really a problem that I have. That's already I have an awesome laptop that's 2 years old or a year and a half old. That is awesome and has great battery life, and it's never a problem for me. Like I never have not enough battery life on my laptop for what I need when I am using it full time. So it's not really for me. I think you can maybe judge the market for such a thing by how many people are walking around all day with dead MacBook Air batteries, basically. Because the MacBook Air had, especially like the 11-inch, where there's not nearly enough room in there for a big battery. So I think if you're walking around with an 11-inch MacBook Air and your battery is always at 5% and dying, and you got to stop using your computer to plug it in for a while, then you're the market for this sort of thing, because you actually really need that. You're pushing the boundaries. But as the boundary keeps getting expanded to have 6-hour battery life, 8-hour battery life, 12-hour battery life, we keep pushing this forward by pretty impressive margins over the last few years. So I think the need for making a dramatic battery life improvement on a laptop is shrinking. Certainly, you can imagine some uses for it, but I don't think it's a mass market use anymore.
Yeah, for the 11-inch Air, I think if you had Broadwell and a low temperature polysilicon or whatever that is, the more energy efficient LCD, Broadwell plus a better LCD would give you acceptable battery life. You'd be up to the point where I don't think many people will be walking around with a dead battery in their 11-inch Air anymore. And that's like next generation, a year or two from now. That's not like way over the horizon. So the window for when ARM would make any sort of sense for battery purposes seems to be closing. But so we should ask you, Casey. You're the laptop guy. Would you make the trade you just offered?
It depends on whether or not I'm still using Windows almost exclusively for my job. And if not, I probably would, assuming that the performance penalty was not egregious. Which is funny because, to be honest, accepting going to and from work, I, for the most part, treat my laptops like desktops. Well, my personal MacBook Pro, which is unusable because it has a platter hard drive, is effectively a desktop. My work MacBook Pro, like I said, other than moving it to and from home, I generally speaking just treat it as a desktop. And so it's kind of hypocritical of me to say that, yes, I'd love tremendously more battery life, but also consider that this is a pre-Retina 2011 MacBook Pro. So I only get 3, maybe 4 hours tops of battery life as it is. And it has dual GPUs. So anytime I have VMware Fusion running, that absolutely toasts my battery. So I'm coming from a place of soreness, if that makes sense. But I would make that trade if I didn't need to worry about virtualization and the performance penalty was not absolutely egregious. I would love to have a laptop wherein I didn't need to worry about the battery ever. And actually,
you just need to buy a new laptop and you'll have that.
The current, especially like the Retinas, have insane battery life.
I know they do, and we're issuing those at work now, but we're on a 3-year cycle, I think, and I'm on year 1.5. So,
who cares? You're famous. You can get one. You can get one faster than that. You are Casey Liss.
Something like that.
I've heard that our work is on an 18-month cycle, and my Mac on my desk is like 5 years old.
Exactly.
Can you maybe trade that credit for Casey?
No, I'm saving that credit to trade up to a fancy iMac when the time comes, but I'm not ready to give it up yet.
Yeah, but it's funny because I upgraded my iPad situation from a third-gen Retina full-size iPad to a Retina iPad Mini. And I don't know if I wouldn't say I have a lemon, but I don't know if it's just my particular iPad Mini, but I feel like the battery life is not nearly as good as the Retina iPad and certainly not as good as my original iPad. And I find that to be really frustrating. And this is the world's biggest first world problem. But I don't know. I feel like I'm charging my iPad a lot more these days, and that it kind of puts this fear in me. It's the same reason I don't put the battery percentage on my phone, because I know if I see it drop 2%, I'm going to start stressing about it. Come to think of it, I should turn it off on my iPad. But nevertheless, I feel like I'm getting to the same point with my iPad as I do with my computer, where if I'm without an outlet for more than a couple hours, I start freaking out. And I bring this up because even what is probably a very small difference in battery life in this new iPad has created an unreasonable amount of stress in my world, which probably says a lot about me as a person. But, having a lot more battery life in my laptop, it would be really tremendous. And I think you guys are completely right that perhaps just a brand new laptop today would be enough. But I don't know, the thought of an ARM laptop that would run for 2 days straight, that's enticing.
Because also the massive gain that we had with Haswell in the last cycle, that was not part of a die shrink. So when they do a process shrink with Broadwell this coming fall or whenever that's supposed to happen, it keeps getting delayed, but probably late this year there's going to be the Broadwell shrink. That's going to be even better. I mean, like that might add another hour. Like if you have like a 13, 14-hour battery, do you think that would relieve your stress? And this is like this isn't like the BS battery specs that we used to hear back in the day. Like all the tests back this up and real world usage back this up. Like if they say you'll get 12 hours, under regular usage, you probably at least get 10.
Yeah,
like it's pretty good. It's pretty close to what they say. Like do you think, like how far do you think it would need to go for you to have that stress relieved, or will you always have that stress because you grew up with very scarce battery, like a laptop battery depression?
No, you're absolutely right. And I think to some degree I will always have that stress. But I think, and this is going to take all the wind out of my own sails, but I think if I had complete confidence that under whatever you define as regular use, or whatever I define as regular use, I could go an entire workday, like an 8 to 10 hour workday, without even thinking about whether or not I need to plug in, that would be enough to make me happy. And the way it is right now, I absolutely cannot do that. Even without VMware Fusion running and kicking on the discrete CPU, I would probably only be able to get half a day-ish. And so to be able to go a whole entire workday without even blinking an eye, and if I leave my power adapter at home, oh well, that would be very liberating.
Yeah, you should wait for Broadwell then, because even with the current crop, you could make it through most of a workday if you're nice to VMware. But like if you include like 12 hours, you're not going to make it working it hard. It'll come close, and you'll have much less stress. And if you just plug it in when you're back at your desk, but you'll have to wait for Broadwell to get you into that type of thing where you can not have a charger at work, not bring your charger from home, and still be comfortable that you can do your work without worrying about like, oh, am I hammering on VMware too much?
Have you considered solving this problem by spending $80 on a second power adapter and just leaving it at work?
Oh, I do. I absolutely do. I have one power adapter at my desk at home and one at work. And the real cure to happiness, or the real secret to happiness, is having an additional one in my laptop bag, so I never have to move the one at work or the one at home. But I don't transport the power adapter to and from work. But nevertheless, I don't know. I wish I didn't have to even think about it. And to go back just one quick second, a lot of people in the chat are saying, well, the reason your Retina iPad's battery life sucks is because you're using it more. And that very well could be, but I feel like the battery drops, the battery percentage drops quicker than I remember it having done in other iPads.
They should have made the Retina Mini thickerer than they did. Because they did make it thicker by some tiny amount. I forget how much, but it's like imperceptibly thicker. But the iPad 3 was perceptibly thicker than the iPad 2. And so when the Mini went Retina, in order to get to maintain battery life, they probably should have made the Mini larger than it currently is to fit more battery in. And then I think you would have been a little bit happier with it. I would also check, you also got it around the same time as the iOS 7 and background app. So I would check if there's some background app doing something stupid that you're not aware of, and also turn off Bluetooth.
Bluetooth is off. I will say that. But you could be right about background apps. I don't think, off the top of my head, there are any that are on there that would be running, other than, iOS just kicking on apps in general. What I mean is it's not like Pod Wrangler's sitting there downloading podcasts constantly or anything like that. But nevertheless, you very well could be right. All right, that went to a place I did not expect, but that's okay. It was accidental.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at Squarespace, the all-in-one platform that makes it fast and easy to create your own professional website or online portfolio. For a free trial and 10% off, go to squarespace.com and use offer code MARCO, because I'm the best ATP host. No, that's just because I picked the code. You'll get your code month. Don't worry. You just got to be patient, because I was first alphabetically, not quite. Squarespace is constantly improving their platform with new features, new designs, and even better support. They have beautiful designs to start with and all the style options you need to create a unique website for you or your business. You can customize your templates with their graphical, nice, pretty interfaces that are nice and easy, or you can go all the way down to the code level and inject your own JavaScript and CSS and have all the customization you could possibly want. It's incredibly easy to use, but if you need any help, Squarespace has an amazing support team. They work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right here in New York City. All this just starts at $8 a month and includes a free domain name if you sign up for a whole year. And really, they have really advanced stuff. They even have, we talked a few months ago about their commerce platform. You can sell physical or digital goods on a Squarespace website. They take care of everything for you, all the shopping cart stuff and inventory tracking and coupon codes that you want to offer. All that stuff, they support an amazingly robust set of features with this. So Squarespace Commerce is included in many of the accounts. And everything you can do with Squarespace, it's easy, it's fast, it's responsive, it works on mobile layouts as well as desktops, and your site looks the same on people's phones and on browsers. It follows your theme. Really, really great. So thanks a lot to Squarespace. Once again, go to squarespace.com and use offer code MARCO to get 10% off your first purchase, and you can get a free trial, no credit card required. Go there, start building your site, see if you like it. I bet you will. And don't forget, when you sign up, use coupon code Marco. Thanks a lot to Squarespace for sponsoring the show once again.
So really quick, I have to confess that the first time I actually used Squarespace myself personally was a week or two ago when I was fiddling with a side project that may or may not ever come to be. And it really is that darn good. It really, truly is. And we've been using it, and by we, I mean Marco has been using it since neutral. But it is so easy to do everything. And I won't extend this ad read for another 20 minutes, even though I could, extolling all the great things about Squarespace. But even if you know what you're doing, if you don't want to, Squarespace is the right answer. If you don't know what you're doing, Squarespace is the right answer. So thanks to them. I was asking a minute ago, did you guys get me anything gold today? All right. I asked because this is our 50th episode, is it not?
Now, wait, which anniversary gift calendar is gold on 50? Because aren't there like 3 competing gift calendars for that sort of thing?
Yep, and I'm looking at Hallmarks, and it says gold is the 50th anniversary.
I can get you some Goldschlager.
I would be happy with that, actually.
Do you have a gold Hypercritical t-shirt?
No, I do have a Hypercritical t-shirt, but it is blue.
Oh, well. That would have been that was my gift for you. I put up for sale a gold t-shirt that you did not buy.
Thanks, John.
So your gift was the opportunity to buy a special shirt.
You would think it's a gift for the number of people who email me and say, "Hey, are those shirts still available?" The answer is no.
You missed out. Speaking of Hypercritical, you wrote a post about the 30th anniversary of the Mac.
Yeah, I should have put that in my calendar. I knew it was coming up like 3 or 4 days ahead of time. Like, oh, I should write something about that. And I tried to write something, but when I started writing it, it ended up being exactly the same thing as what I wrote when Steve Jobs died, because I guess the two things are linked in my life, Steve Jobs and the Mac, much more so than I think most people who came to Apple stuff later. So yeah, we'll put the link in the show notes. It's not that exciting, but the reason I put it in there was because Macworld was doing a podcast where they were collecting short, like 5-minute remembrances from people who use the Mac. But it wasn't a live podcast with other people. They wanted us to pre-record stuff, and I'm terrible at pre-recording things, and that's all I had to bail, and I couldn't do it. But I did think of something I wanted to say about the original Mac, and after hearing Marco profess his Mac noobiness on the talk show, I figured
that was the most epic troll to you. No one else will care.
No, there's lots of people will care.
Actually, a friend of the show, Guy English, was not happy.
Yeah, and he's like your age. I don't know. Maybe he isn't. No one knows how old he really is. It's very difficult to tell with Canadians.
It's the beard. You just can't see past it.
What is he hiding? Anyway, so here's my brief little remembrance thing that I was going to do for Macworld, but didn't, about the original Mac, and I think it will be good for young people and noobs as well. And the thing I was going to say that I remembered about the Mac, and I had the original Mac in 1984, was what it was like to walk up to the computer and turn it on. Which sounds weird, but hear me out. I think it has some foundation. Well, or not. We'll find out. So the power button on the Mac was on the back, and you used your left hand to reach the back of the computer and flick it. And it was a rocker switch that tilted up and down. And the Mac itself was very upright. I don't know if people must know what the original Mac looked like. Kind of like a vertical rectangle in front of you with a little square screen near the top. So you'd reach around the back left side and flick the switch. And it was a big mechanical flicky switch like that you would see like on a 70s mixing board or something. This was not some tiny little button or a circle with the little power symbol on it that depresses 3 millimeters in. This was a big switch that made a noise. You flick that switch, the CRT came on, and the thing made a beeping noise, like the startup beep. Pretty loud, not like cool chord music, but a beeping noise. And the reason this motion of walking up to this vertical computer, reaching around behind it and flicking the switch and sitting down in the chair at the same time sticks in my mind is because you did it so often. You didn't put the computer to sleep. There was no sleep for the computer. You didn't leave it on all the time because that would be crazy. It would be like leaving your TV on all the time or a light on all the time. When you wanted to use the computer, you walked up to it, you turned it on, and you used it. And it would boot up, and it would take forever to boot up off the floppy disk. And, you do whatever you're going to do with the computer. And the second reason that power switch sticks in my mind was because when you're done using the computer, you reached around the back of it, and you turn the power switch off. Right in the middle of what there was no shutdown command at the bottom of what was then the special menu. No shutdown, no nothing. When you were done using the computer, you turned it off. And we like to think that the computers we're using today are just like fancy versions of the Mac that was back then. Like, oh, they got a GUI, they got the menu bar. Some of the menus are even the same, file, edit, the special menu's gone. But like the Apple menu was in the corner that had windows with widgets in them and resizing and scrolls, like the same thing, right? But the incredible distance between that and now is represented by like how we treated the computer. We treated it like you treat the television set. When you want to use it, you turn it on. When you want to use it, you turn it off. There was no software interconnect preventing you from or telling you when it was safe to turn it off, or preventing you from turning it off at any time. Now you can turn it off Mac anytime you want now. Like I hold down the power button for 10 seconds, like if it gets hard frozen or whatever. But clearly that power button is not a mechanical interconnect that, the computer had no control. Like when you flick that switch, electricity stopped flowing to the computer. That was it. And when you turned it on, electricity started flowing. And so that is one of my lasting memories of the computer that I think most people who are not around back then using computers can't relate to, because maybe they're like, oh, I turned on my Commodore 64 that way. That's how I use my Atari. That's how I use my NES. And I think a lot of people like to think that it's how they're using their current PlayStation stuff, not knowing that those buttons are software buttons that just tell the thing to shut down, because you can't turn off a real game console like that without consequences most of the time. But back then, it was a GUI computer that looks like what we have today, but it behaved like a toaster. You'd flick the switch on, you'd flick the switch off.
That I did not know that, and that seems really wild to me.
Oh, and also there were no lights, no indicator lights telling you the drive activity. Because PCs, it used to, for a long time, PCs were still like that. And you're like, how do I know when I can push the eject button to get the disk out? Oh, wait for the light to stop blinking. Is it done? Wait, no, one more blink. Wait, no, okay, now. Wait, no, one more blink. Like, that was crazy making as well. No light on the front of the Mac. So how did you know, like, what if it was in the middle of writing data to a floppy disk and you turned it off? Well, you probably just hosed yourself if that was the case. But, like, there was no light, I guess, because they wouldn't want to have some stupid blinking light. There was no eject button because they wanted the computer to control that. You still had to unmount a disk, by dragging it to the trash or hitting eject or whatever, and it would safely eject and unmount the disk. But when you were done using the computer, presumably you're not in the middle of saving and, don't have any outstanding stuff. You would just reach behind and hit the switch.
See, that was the best thing about the original Mac, is that wonderful, unintuitive design right from the start of, to eject a disk, you do the same thing you do when you want to delete data.
Well, here was the best thing about that. So first of all, that was a shortcut. Like the way you were supposed to do is the same way you would do anything. You select it and then select an item from the menu. It's like that you would select the noun and select the verb from the menu. So there was an eject thing you could get the disk out. But the best was, since there was only one floppy drive and you couldn't get much done with one 400K floppy, you could eject the system disk that you booted from, and it would remain on the desktop as a grayed out floppy disk icon. And then you would put in, say, your Mac Paint disk, which application on a separate disk, put that in. And then the Mac Paint floppy disk would appear on your desktop as a little floppy disk icon, but not grayed out. And you could, launch Mac Paint, and sometimes it would ask you to swap disks back and forth. Eventually you get to the point where the system disk is back in, and you've got a grayed out icon of the Mac Paint floppy disk on there. And the Mac Paint floppy disk is in your hand, right? Then you would drag the ghostly image of the Mac Paint floppy disk to the trash, and nothing would eject because you've already got the disk out. The ghost disk would just disappear. It was a very strange metaphor for, what am I throwing out here? I'm not ejecting a disk because it's in my hand, but I'm throwing out this little image, and the image does disappear. Did I erase everything on the disk? But how could I have erased everything on the disk? It's in my hand, but nothing ejected, so I wasn't ejecting. Very, very confusing. Of course, it made totally intuitive sense to, an 8-year-old, 9-year-old me, because, like, anything you learned, of course, that's the way it works. Don't you know how ghost images work for disks? Like, things make sense to kids that you don't question, but yeah, it was very strange.
See, and the terribleness of the disk and virtual disk and ghost disk and disk image kind of metaphor continues to this day when you still have Mac software being distributed in DMGs.
Yeah, at least those don't get grayed out. But yeah, you're like, where is the disk? What's a disk image? Like, what I'm saying is an image of a disk, not disk image, which is an entirely different thing. That's what you're talking about.
But still, it's like that whole thing with, like, kind of complicating the disk metaphor. Yeah, it's like it's always one of the weirdest things about the Mac, and thank God they've mostly dodged it now with the App Store. By pushing people to do that as the installation method, but for decades, years at least, well, not I guess OS 10 introduced disk images, right? So for a decade, like, the way to install software on a Mac that you'd have to, like, tell your parents was, all right, you download this disk image, it mounts it, it's a virtual disk, it's not a real disk, you have to look for where the disks are on your computer and find this fake disk that you just downloaded. Don't run it from there, though. You got to move it to your real disk, then eject the fake disk. Nothing will actually eject from your computer, and then you got to delete this file that represents that fake disk when it's not mounted.
Disk images existed before OS 10, but before OS 10, the way most software was distributed was in Stuffit or Stuffit.hqx, because Stuffit files had resource forks for a short period of time, or any other compressed file format. And what you would get when you decompressed it is, if you were lucky, you would get an application, and if you're unlucky, you would get an installer. And there was a series of bad installers doing their installer thing. But yeah, that the root problem with disk images is not so much that it's the concept of a virtual disk image, but the entire concept of mounting and unmounting disks, whether they're virtual disks, real disks, or not. Mounting and unmounting is beyond the ken of regular people.
Well, you say that, but it's actually beyond a lot of people. So this past Friday, I was at a work meeting, and it was all of the developers at my office, which is only 10 or 15 of us, I'd say. And a developer that doesn't typically use a Mac ended up using my boss's Mac in order to do a quick PowerPoint presentation. And that also involved using Safari or Chrome or whatever his browser of choice was in order to show a few things that he had worked on. And firstly, he had a really hard time figuring out how to scroll because there was no scroll bar, which in and of itself I thought was kind of funny, but made sense. I mean, I can't fault him for that. Secondly, he fell under the same trap that Erin falls under anytime she tries to use my Mac, which is, for most power users, I have to assume that they have hot corners and they have gestures set up. And if you're not familiar and used to that, it's very off-putting because you feel like you haven't touched anything, and then suddenly random crap happens that makes no sense. Well, anyways, the reason I bring this up is because he had his presentation on a USB key, and when he was all done, what did he do? Do you want to take a guess, John?
Just yanked out like they do in the movies.
Just like they do with Windows and just like they do in the movies. And so he just yanked that bad boy out, and of course, instantly, my boss's Mac goes, whoa, 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 whoa. You didn't unmount that bad boy. I don't even know what's going on with that thing. And it was interesting to me because, all jokes aside, here's someone who writes code for a living, and he knows what he's doing. But because he's not familiar with OS 10, it didn't even cross his mind to unmount the USB key. Why would you? You just yank the thing out like you do on Windows, right? And so it was just interesting to me.
Well, even on Windows, like, you have to do the blinking light dance, which is why so many USB keys have little lights on them, because you can yank it out on Windows, but if you yank it out in the middle when the little light is blinking, your USB key now has garbage on it, so congratulations.
Which, by the way, when I first got my first Mac, and I think it was 2010, one of the things that I found extremely disconcerting was there were no hard drive lights or anything like that. And to this day, I still have iStat menus running constantly. And I don't have it showing hard drive activity, but I do have it showing throughput through my network card and CPU load, because I can't, I don't know why, but I feel...
See, you're one of those people who would have bought back in the day, there was a program for the Mac called Disklight that would put a little blinking black and white thing in your little black and white menu bar to make people like you feel comfortable.
Well, and again, it's not actually about disk usage, but it bothers me if something is happening slowly, which, to be fair, on my work MacBook Pro with its SSD is not terribly often. But if something's happening slowly, or if my my fans are spinning, I want to know why. And so I run iStat menus, which is absolutely the best $30 or so I've spent in a long time. I look at my little menu widget, whatever that thing is called, and I see my CPU usage right there. And if I click on it, I can see the top 5, most expensive processes. And I don't know, it just freaks me out not having that there. And I keep telling myself to get rid of it. And like, for example, I've gotten rid of...
No, don't.
Well, and I've gotten rid of my memory meter, but I still have CPU and I still have internet throughput.
You should get rid of it because it's kind of the quantum, uncertainty principle of computer performance, that by observing it, you are necessarily altering the behavior. And I always wonder, how much am I altering it by observing it? I don't leave Activity Monitor open. I don't leave Top running in a terminal window, and I don't run the iStat menu things, unless I'm curious. If I'm curious about something, it's like turning on all the instruments or running instruments in Xcode. Sometimes you want to fire all that stuff up to see, but people who run it all day, every day, not great.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's suppose you're buying a new Mac Pro. What CPU do you get?
I don't know. This is talking about laptops. Who cares about desktops? You burn all the power you want.
Fine. Laptops. Do you get a 13-inch with only a dual core, or do you go 15-inch with a quad core?
I don't know what I would get with a laptop, but what are you getting at? That I would want a more powerful computer?
No, I'm saying so I've been running iStat menus also forever. I ran. There was some other thing that did the same thing before that, and it was worse. So I switched to iStat menus, and probably 4 or 5 years ago by now, and I've been running it for a while. And just like Casey, I used to have the hard drive indicator on there. Once I switched to SSDs, I removed it because it was pointless at that point. But I still have the CPU and the network ones up. So the network ones, first of all, is very useful if you want to see, like, am I currently uploading tons of stuff while I'm podcasting? That's bad. Then you can go check Dropbox, check Backblaze, all this stuff. And then the CPU meter is great because it gives you an idea of how much CPU power you're actually using with the work you do and where you're hitting bottlenecks and what kind of bottlenecks you're hitting so that you can make intelligent decisions about what to upgrade and then what to buy for your next computer.
I still think that's an activity you could do when you're curious about that. When your computer is feeling slow, take a look at why it's slow. When you're interested in whether this application takes advantage of how many cores, fire it up. But I don't think you need to run it all day because you're not looking at it all day. It's mostly just in the corner, animating, distracting your eye, and you're not looking at it to gain information from it during that time.
I glance at it a lot.
Yep.
That's another reason you should get rid of it. It's like the thing you always have to keep looking at. It's like looking at the time on the clock on a wall. Got to keep looking up. Got to keep looking up. Just take the clock away, concentrate on what you're doing, and you'll spend less time looking at the clock.
I don't know. I think basically whenever I'm being made to wait for something at all on my computer, usually I will glance at that to see, like, am I maxing out a CPU? Like before it would be like, am I maxing out a disk? Like that. It helps a lot to know what your performance needs are, generally speaking. So I know now how much of my stuff is going to benefit from having more cores and how much of it isn't, and how much of it is going to benefit from having like one super fast core rather than more cores that are slower. Like I have a good idea of what I need because I've been running this for years, and because it's always running, and so I can always just kind of glance up there. So I know how my stuff behaves and what my needs actually are. Whereas if you don't do this kind of thing, you're kind of buying blind, or your computer's slow and you might think, okay, I guess I'll add some RAM or something, but you don't really know, like, is it slow because of X, Y, or Z? And you're just kind of guessing.
I don't know how many conclusions you can get from just looking at that. Because when my computer is slow, I go right either. I mostly go to the command line because I'm going to run SC usage, FS usage to see who's hitting the file systems. Because for me and my non-SSD systems, that's usually the big one. But I don't want to just know, there's a lot of I/O going on. How many IOPS are there? An activity monitor. What is the data throughput? I want to know who is using the file system and what are they doing with it. What files are they modifying? So that's why I want like the FS usage with the wide output. For the file system type to get that information. You're not going to get that from iStat menu.
I think you do, actually.
I think the main reason both of you are running iStat menu is probably the only reason you should run iStat menu is because you like blinking lights and pretty things. And that's a reasonably legitimate reason to, like, a lot of people run, for example, transparent terminal windows, which make things in their terminal windows harder to read. But they like it because it looks cool.
See, I disagree. I really do think that everything Marco said, I was shaking my head yes, in that if there's any delay on my computer, particularly my SSD MacBook Pro, I'm looking at that CPU meter to see what's going on. And if there's a spike that I don't expect, then darn it, I'm going to click on that CPU meter to see what the top processes are. And if AirMail or if CrashPlan is going berserk, then I need to investigate why that is. And additionally, that's why, to go back in the episode, that's why I said I would probably trade a less powerful Mac for a MacBook for one that has a much better battery.
If you want to get better battery life, why not just turn that off?
Actually, when Mavericks came out, I did crank back the update frequency from like 1 second to like 5 or something like that. But anyway, the reason I'm so willing to make that trade is because I know, generally speaking, my CPU usage really isn't that much. Now, when I have VMware running, okay, then it's not too awesome in that I'm using probably a third of my CPU all the time. But excepting when VMware is running, most of the crap I do on my computer, I really don't need a very powerful CPU for. So that's why I think I would be willing to make that trade. And that's why I think Marco was onto something with it gives you some kind of passive feedback on where your bottlenecks are.
And if you're burning power unnecessarily. Like, if you have a 4-core machine and you got some runaway process burning 100% all the time because it's stuck on something, you might not really, you might not notice that for days. because it is not really affecting you at all. And all that time, then your battery life's getting worse. Your system's running a little bit too warm, or the fans are running a little bit too fast. If it's a process that's writing log files, like I have this weird problem a lot of times. I don't know if it's because of the hijacking setup with this live stream. I have this problem recently where iTunes agent, some kind of iTunes airport agent, crashes repeatedly in the background, and it burns up a CPU for a while, and as it's doing this, it's dumping tons of crap to the console log, like hundreds of megabytes of text to the console log. And the only way I can really tell is either by looking up there and seeing, oh, there's that core that's been running for a while. I wonder what it's doing, and clicking the icon and it shows me what it's doing, or my terminal windows start taking forever to reach the login prompt, and then you have to like go purge out the directory and find the Mac hint that does that. And, but like if you can't see those kind of indicators, like if I didn't launch terminal for a while, that would take days, and I wouldn't notice it. And I'd be sitting here burning power and running too hot and filling up my disk with all this crap and not even noticing.
But the difference between you and I, Marco, and John, is that we are not one with our machine like he is.
He can feel the menu meters. That's what it was called, menu meters.
If you don't notice that something is taking an entire core, and you don't notice that something is dumping 100 megs to your thing, then it's probably actually not a problem. Like, I know it's a problem and that you shouldn't be doing that, but like, I'm mostly content to wait until my machine is not performing the way I think it is and investigate why that is. Versus if something like that happened and like it cured itself, or I just never noticed it. Like again, I'm not using a laptop, I'm plugged in. I don't notice the fans going up. I don't notice, maybe I'm using slightly more power or whatever. But like, I think for me, if something was dumping 100 megs, I would notice that, and I would go and investigate it like that.
You don't have an SSD yet.
No, yeah, that's right. I would definitely notice it. I would hear the hard drive going tick tick tick. But there are many things that go off and you don't notice, and I'm perfectly content to let them be below my notice. If the only reason I would notice them is because of the stat, some kind of stat counter thing, then that's like drawing my attention unnecessarily, right? Like, intellectually, yes, I would like to know that thing is crashing and see if I can investigate it or do something about it. But practically speaking, if I would not notice if it was not for the stat stuff, I'd just as soon not notice it. You know what I mean?
Because you don't run a laptop.
That's very true.
Yeah, but again, with a laptop, I would say just at least just like decrease the upgrade frequency. Like every 1 second is too much. And I really hope the people who make iStat menus get religion about the Mavericks power saving stuff, because if you're going to make an app that's like that, there are probably a lot of things you can do to your app itself to make it more power efficient, even with the same update frequency.
Yeah, and usually, is it Django? It's BJANGO, I believe. I'm probably mispronouncing it. I'm sorry, but they're usually pretty on the ball with getting the latest. I don't want to say trends. That sounds dismissive, but getting those newest features supported.
Yeah, they're pretty good citizens on the platforms.
That's a much better way of phrasing it. Hey, do we have any other new sponsors this week by chance?
We have one more new sponsor this week. It is our friends at Cards Against Humanity.
Wait. What?
Yeah, Cards Against Humanity, that awesome game that you and I have played, and it's fantastic. It's sponsored by Cards Against Humanity, but they asked us not to read an ad and to just enjoy the show.
But that was it?
That's it.
That's the whole thing?
Isn't that great?
I'm not at all surprised by this, but that's ridiculous.
Those guys are the best. Anyway, they didn't ask us to tell you, but it's cardsagainsthumanity.com because they're just awesome. So thanks a lot to Cards Against Humanity.
That was our big moment. I have been so excited for them to maybe possibly one day sponsor our show, and that's what they decide to do. I'm both like a little sad and overwhelmed with happiness.
It's pretty awesome.
Well, thanks, guys.
Yeah.
We should play that. We should do that on air sometime.
Well, we might lose our clean rating if we do.
We just might. Well, I feel like we're dishonoring their the motive there, so we should just move on.
All right, let's get back to it.
Lenovo bought some things recently. Do we care about that?
Do we have time to care about that?
I don't know. Do we? Are we done? Is that
I
a
love
hint?
It. Our show could spend the first almost hour and a half today of all days, with all this stuff in the news happened today, and we haven't talked about any of it. Not even a bit.
But is it news? Is there anything that we really care about if you don't care about like the game, the meta game of company versus company and who owns what and stuff like that? I don't know if there's much about the industry that any of these particular deals change other than continuing existing trends that everyone already is familiar with.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It seems like Lenovo is basically just becoming IBM's hardware, and I know IBM still does big hardware, big server hardware, but they took the PC business, and I don't know. I'm very hipster about all this, but they killed the ThinkPad, and now they're taking the x86 server business, and apparently Motorola as well.
Well, they're in an economy that's like up and coming in a way that the U.S. economy is not. Like they are us many years in the past. It kind of makes sense that businesses that are not interesting or profitable enough or have enough growth potential for us could have enough growth potential for them, be more profitable for them, more interesting for them. So they would like to make a phone. They would like to sell PCs. They'll happily sell PC class server hardware. I mean, I don't know how the low end server hardware. Low end just means x86, which is basically like the server hardware that almost everybody buys. Not a bad business. I mean, like I know you're upset about that, what they did to your beautiful ThinkPad, but for the most part, Lenovo took IBM's PC business and didn't screw it up. At the very least, can you give them that? They didn't screw it up.
Yeah, they have a pretty good record of that, of not screwing up the things they've bought too badly. I mean, I think even most people who are ThinkPad fans would agree that the Lenovo transition really didn't change much.
Well, compare it to compare it to Google buying Motorola, and did they screw up? Motorola came pre-screwed up, so that's not fair. But right. A lot of times, someone will, you'll acquire a company, and just like you won't be able to figure out how to make any money with it, and the products will be worse under you, and it will just fizzle. And people might say that Lenovo's products are worse in some ways than IBM, or lost some of the specialness they had with IBM, or aren't as interesting as they were under IBM. But it's still an ongoing business. And like that was my fear when they bought them, because who had ever heard of Lenovo when they took IBM's PC business? That like in 2 years you won't be able to buy a Lenovo PC because they'll not be able to make a go of this. It'll just fizzle out and they just won't be successful. But you can still buy Lenovo PCs and laptops, and maybe they're not as special as a ThinkPad with a butterfly keyboard, but they're reasonable PCs. Like, what would you rather have, a Lenovo laptop or a Dell, a Lenovo or an HP laptop? Just, I don't know, slim pickings there, but
is none an option?
Exactly right. Again, get a Mac, please. But yeah.
Oh man, no. Fun fact: my dad has worked for IBM for I don't know, probably about 30-ish years, and I vividly remember seeing ThinkPads floating around the house when I was really little, because the ThinkPad, in case you didn't know, is named after these pads that they used to hand out to the employees that just said the word think on the front, and that was it. And I vividly remember seeing those all over the place. And so I grew up on ThinkPads, and I grew up using a track pointing device. And if you've never seen the XKCD about this, go Google it and check it out. But I still miss that. I genuinely do. And Apple trackpads are as good as they get, or touchpads, whatever they're called. They're as good as those sorts of things get. But I still miss and prefer the track point. I don't know. Maybe I'm the only one. Which actually, I meant to ask you guys: do either of you guys use the Magic Trackpad?
No.
No. What are you, crazy?
Okay, that's what I thought too. But a lot of people I know are starting to get really excited about the trackpad.
I'm always suspicious of somebody when they tell me they prefer a trackpad to a mouse.
I tend to agree.
Any kind of trackpad. I know people who use that. I know people who use trackpads at their desk with their desktop computer, and I also know people who prefer the centered trackpad underneath their keyboard on their laptop to using a mouse on their desktop. And those people should be eyed with great suspicion.
All right, so we don't really care about them buying Motorola and Google unloading Motorola.
I mean, it's like a terrible failed. I don't know what. I mean, they got the patents. They're keeping the patents. When they bought Motorola, the only interesting thing about that acquisition, like the A story is, okay, they're bought Motorola for the patents. Like, no, but I think they might be buying them because they're going to make their own phones, and Motorola makes hardware. And so that turned out not to be the case. They admitted as much in their thing. We originally bought them for I guess there was a chance that if Motorola's new phones took off, Google would say, hey, wait a second. we can sell the OS to other people, but then compete with them by making our own hardware that sells in huge numbers instead of the Nexus, which sell in smaller numbers, I would imagine. But turns out no one wants a Motorola phone either. So yeah, it's a shame because the most recent Motorola phones are pretty decent. Like they're interesting, they're nice looking, they work pretty well for Android phones. Like they're not terrible phones. I'm sure Lenovo will continue to make not terrible phones out of them. And if who knows, they're well positioned to do well in China. So if that business starts picking up, they're going to be right there, ready to sell cheap Android phones to all of China.
Do you think it has anything to do with a possible Google Samsung future partnership of some sort? Like getting Motorola out of the way. Like Google couldn't buy Samsung; they're too big. But as far as I know, do you think that the news came out today also that Google has apparently pressured Samsung to stop doing their incredibly different interface on their tablets that they were working on, and possibly on their phones as well. I don't know all the details of it, but clearly Google is kind of pressuring Samsung to work more closely with them. What if getting Motorola out of the way, besides being financially wise, because they kept losing even more money on it every year that they kept it, what if that kind of helped that too? I mean, I don't know. It sounds like a stretch, but you never know. Honestly, all of this makes me think that the way they bought Motorola kind of out of the blue, and then spent way too much on it. Even back then, everyone said that was way too much. Supposedly, it was maybe for patents, but the patents turn out to not really be worth anything. And
I think the patents are worth something. Not the crazy $1 billion numbers they're giving there, but they're definitely worth something. They're not worth it in that you're going to be able to sue everybody else for violating your patents, but I think having that big staple, it's like it sows enough uncertainty in the people who are going to come at you with their stupid patents. They're like, well, we have a lot of stupid patents too, and you're not sure, and maybe the few they've used have lost in court, but it's a hell of a lot of patents, and they're really stupid. So I think it serves its purpose as the mutually assured destruction sort of black bag of crap. They massively overpaid for that, but it's better than not having it at all. So I don't know. And as for like the pressuring, like Samsung saying, all right, if you want us to do a more stock Android appearance, you need to get rid of that Motorola. I don't think Samsung was threatened by Motorola of selling the piddling number of crappy phones that they were selling. And I don't think Samsung was in a position to bargain like that, or at least they shouldn't have been. If they made that threat and Google believed it and acted based on that threat being an actual thing they should be scared of, that was stupid, because that's an insane threat. Like the threat would be basically, we'll do your default Android appearance thing, but you have to do this thing for us. And Google will say, why do we have to do that thing for you? Well, if you don't, we're not going to make our phones use the stock Google appearance. And we don't need your stinking maps, and we don't need your stinking Gmail. We'll do everything ourselves. And Google should have said, okay, good luck with that. Because I don't think Samsung is in a position. I mean, hell, Apple was barely in a position to not use Google Maps. I'm not sure Samsung is in a position to do away with all of the things that Google gives them. They're an Android vendor, for crying out loud. It's hard. They could do like the Kindle route, where you're like, Amazon's like, we don't really need anything from you, Google, except for your OS, thanks. I don't think that's a viable strategy for Samsung. It's possible that Samsung is deluded enough that they think that's a viable strategy for them, that we don't need you, Google. At any second, we could go off on our own and we'll be just as successful without you. I think that strategy would work for like a year, and then Samsung would realize they're not Google. So I'm not sure, but I hope Google didn't give any credence to that. But I think getting rid of Motorola is the right move, because if you're not going to use Motorola as your hardware wing and become like an Apple style, like we make the hardware and the software, if you're not going to do that, what the hell point is there in having a phone maker? All it's going to do is make your relationships with all the people you license your OS to more fraught with angst than it needs to be. And yeah, you paid $12.5 billion for it, but cut your losses.
So who has the real leverage between Samsung and Google? Do you still think it's Google? And I ask because it seems to me like most of the phones that I see that are Android phones, and I won't even wager guesses to the percentage, but it seems like well over half are Samsung phones. So is Google getting to the point that they're getting beholden to Samsung? I mean, what you just said made me think no, but do you think so?
No, because like Samsung is making all the money in the Android market, and Google hates that. And so, like, but they're not beholden to Google. They just want Samsung. They just want to Google needs to figure out a way to make money from Android, and B, the power of Samsung is making that more difficult. Like, they're making the money, and so that's Google leaning on them to say you have to have a more of a default Android experience. Is them trying to say what we want is an undifferentiated sea of people shipping on our OS on commodity hardware. They want to go back in time and pretend like they're Microsoft and selling Windows to every PC vendor. And Samsung doesn't want to be every PC vendor. They want to differentiate. But it's not as if Samsung, like, if Google's already not making most of the money in the Android ecosystem, what is Samsung taking away? Samsung's already reaping all the profits from Android, right? They've already done that to Google. So I don't see how Samsung has any leverage over Google to say, well, we'll just change everything to Windows Phone and stop using Android. It's like, fine, we weren't making any money off you using Android anyway. So it's
Sure.
Their relationship is not, they're not two happy campers next to each other. And I don't know what, Google at least has a stopgap of like, well, this whole Android thing was silly. We're going to switch to Chrome OS for everything.
Yeah, I think it's even you can look at like the relationship between Apple and Samsung with not with the lawsuits and stuff, but just with the hardware manufacturing deals that they have, where Apple still needs Samsung for so much of their component manufacturing, especially the more complicated processors and stuff, it doesn't look like they're going to stop needing Samsung in the next few years. Maybe they'll slowly work towards that by bringing up different fabs and stuff. But they're going to keep using Samsung as a manufacturing partner for a while, or a component partner for a while. And so Samsung and Apple, you could tell they don't really like each other, but they keep working together because Samsung will take the money because it's a lot of money, and Apple needs their capacity and their chip manufacturing. So I think similarly, Google and Samsung kind of need each other too. By having Android, Samsung is making a killing, and Samsung, personality-wise, it's pretty hard to get a read on them in much detail. But it does seem like personality-wise, like they're not like a stubborn, principled company. If there's a way to make money doing something, they're just going to do it. They don't really care what it is. They're not going to like hold a grudge against Google and say, oh well, you're kicking us around, so we're going to stop using Android. No, they won't. They might make their own additional line of phones with something else on it, but they're not going to stop selling Android phones. They don't care. If they can make money selling Android phones, they'll keep selling Android phones and they'll keep making a lot of money. And Google needs them because, yeah, like as you said, like there's not really a lot of other people making Android stuff that serves Google well. Like Amazon's selling a good amount of it, but that's not really helping Google very much. And there's other manufacturers, like mostly like regional ones, like in China and India. There's manufacturers that also make a ton of Android stuff, but that doesn't help Google very much because it doesn't run a lot of their services or any of their services. So Samsung is probably the only company making a good amount of Google serviced connected Android things and actually selling them worldwide. And so they kind of can't afford to have animosity toward each other. Like I think you're right. Google wanted with Android, I think they expected there to be all these manufacturers with a diverse ecosystem providing healthy competition. And in reality, everyone else has died because Samsung was really good at it, and everyone else was really bad at it. And so there's it totally is dysfunctional to have like one giant manufacturer making the majority of your stuff.
Well, and not just the number of manufacturers. They expected, well, we're going to make the software part, and the margins on software are massive, so we're going to make huge margins on the software we sell, and those poor suckers making the hardware are going to make tiny little hardware margins, where, as it turns out, Samsung's making the bulk of the profit in what you would define as the Android market, because they make way more profit on the phones they sell than Google makes on the licensing of the OS to Samsung. And so that's the imbalance there. That like all the money in the vast majority of the money in the Android ecosystem is being made by a hardware manufacturer, and Google's got to be like, but doesn't software have higher margins? How are we not making money? And so I think Google's trying to go back to its bread and butter and saying it seems like no matter who's out there, even if there were 15 hardware makers, the accumulated profit made by those 15 hardware makers that evenly divided the market would still dwarf the license fees that we get. So it doesn't seem like that we're going to make money, because they get the magic of like subsidized phones in the U.S. and getting all that money for giving you a subscriber for a long period of time, and the hardware itself has reasonable margins, and they're not making enough money off Android itself. So I think they want to go back to their old style, which is, all right, we're going to make money by people using Google services. And that's why they switched to, never mind all the profit stuff, let's just make sure that the people who are selling Android phones continue to be a gateway to get people into our Google services so we can show them our Google ads and get information about them in Google Plus and all the googly things we do.
I think we're done.
Thanks to our 3 sponsors this week, HelpSpot, Squarespace, and Cards Against Humanity, and we'll see you next week.
Now the show is over. They didn't even mean to begin, 'cause it was accidental. Oh, it was accidental. John didn't do any research. Marco and Casey wouldn't let him, 'cause it was accidental. Oh, it was accidental. And you can find the show notes at atp.fm. And if you're into Twitter, you can follow them at CASEYLISS. So that's Casey Liss, MARCOARMENT, Marco Arment, SIRAC, USA Syracuse. It's accidental. They didn't mean to. Accidental. Tech podcast so long.
I seem to recall maybe hearing about this somewhere on the internet. It might have been apocryphal. Some people saying, we'll get the email about this if you put it in the show, people who preferred to play first-person shooters with a trackpad instead of a mouse.
What?
What?
That's the same reaction I have to people who prefer to play first-person shooters with a thumbstick instead of a mouse, but that's a whole other thing. But I'm pretty sure I've heard at least one person who preferred playing first-person shooters with a trackpad. It's just like people who grow up with trackpads, there's something wrong with them. I don't know.
Kids these days with their input methods.
No, but like it would be fine if it was actually better. Like if it was more, if you make a challenge where there was like a series of dots on the screen and they would, you ever see those challenges where a dot will appear in a random location, you have to click on it, and as soon as you click on it, another dot appears. There are objective ways to measure how efficient you are with your input device, and go ahead, trackpad people, bring it on against a mouse person. Same thing with first-person shooters. Auto aim has bred an entire generation of people who think that they're better with a thumbstick than with a mouse, when in reality it's the game drawing their fire to the enemy because they happen to be somewhere near where they are.
Paraps is swearing in the chat that he or she is much better with the trackpad, which means he or she is crazy.
Or using auto aim and not realizing it, or not wanting to admit it.
Well, no, if you're playing with it like a PC game, a Mac game, it doesn't know you're using a trackpad. I don't think it's auto aiming because you're using a trackpad. Maybe just people don't know how to use a mouse. I don't know.
Maybe it's like grade inflation. Like, you want to just like make everyone feel better, like they did better, even though they still suck. And they're like, oh, well, hey, you hit him. We'll call that a hit. Good job. Everyone's a winner here.
One thing we should talk about at some point is what will we reflect on in 20 or 30 years as being the clear sore spot in computers today. And before
spinning disks,
I was going to say exactly that. So let's assume that that spinning disks are already in the past and we can't use that as an answer. What would it be? Because we all have, gigs and gigs and gigs of RAM. We generally speaking have big enough hard drives. You could make an argument that the SSDs being considerably smaller because they're much too expensive otherwise. I would allow that as an answer. But if not those, then what? What's the bottleneck?
Non-retina screens, or are you going to also put that in the past?
No, I would allow that. I think that would be fair.
I would say having very short laptop battery lives, because that, like, it depends on what time we're talking about. If we're talking about like this year, then maybe not. But even just like 3 years ago, in that era where almost everyone at that point was buying laptops if they were a normal person. Hardly anybody bought desktops, even as of 5 years ago. So laptops really took over in the last decade so strongly, but they weren't very good. So I think having laptops being very hot and with short battery lives and maybe big and heavy also, but that fixed itself towards the end of the decade. I think that might be it. Because remember, like, we're talking about moving from desktops in the 90s to laptops in the 2000s.
Yeah.
If you're already fast forwarding us past SSDs and Retina screens, which I think is kind of fair, because if you just start from like the best of modern computers and say that's the status quo going forward, like a baby is born and they never see a spinning disk or whatever, that's not what they're going to ding us for. So I think the babies born today will probably ding us for phones that break when you drop them, if we're lucky.
Ooh, good call.
You know, because
Good call.
I mean that's a tough call because you're not sure if there's going to be material science breakthroughs that lead to that, but all of us now know that you drop your phone on cement. You're like, maybe it's gonna break, maybe it's not, maybe it'll just get dinged. But like, it's weird. If there's a material science breakthrough that allows that not to be something we have to worry about so much, it will look ridiculous that we had these things that were so fragile that cost so much money that we carried around with us. And it's like, oh, if you dropped it on cement, it was over. And it's like saying to someone today, if you drop your keys on cement when you're fumbling with them to get into your car, never mind that it won't need keys to get into cars in that way because they'll all be Marco's proximity key. But anyway, the idea that if you drop your keys on the ground, your keys are still fine, right? Well, our phones, if you drop them on the ground, they're not fine anymore. And I feel like it's possible in our lifetime that there could be a material science breakthrough that makes that seem ridiculous.
In the same way that there could be a battery breakthrough.
And that also is worth pointing out, too, that, you know, we, in the same ways that, like, it's kind of irrelevant to us what happens with mainframes these days, I think our kids are not going to really care what computers were like when, you know, in today's era. They're going to be talking about what mobile phones were like in today's era. And so from that point of view, maybe battery life is the thing, because battery life on laptops, as we said earlier, is getting pretty solid to the point where most people don't really run into issues that often anymore with the newest models, and that's probably going to keep going in that direction. Whereas with phones, it seems like we're kind of at this standstill where the industry is still so competitive with moving the hardware forward, making everything more powerful, making the screens bigger and brighter and higher density and all this stuff. So we're kind of at battery stagnation where, and sometimes it even gets worse, where, you know, as everything gets more complicated and more advanced and more powerful and bigger, we're still getting like about a day of casual use and less than a day of heavy use. And we've kind of been there for a while now. Hopefully, by the time our kids, at least my kid, by the time he's old enough to care, John, your kids probably already care, but by the time that my kid's old enough to care, maybe having a multiple day battery life on a phone will be the common case.
Phone batteries are tough because you have to transmit. That's the killer, I think, on phones. Like you can make the phone consume zero energy for its screen and CPU. You have to transmit so that some tower, I guess, you know, if they come up with whatever a successor to LTE is able to use even less power, but I worry that that's the limiting factor. It's like you are a physical distance and you must send, unless we have quantum entanglement where we can just, you know, convey information without transmitting radio waves.
Well, but look at how cell phones have progressed over time. Over time, cell phone towers have gotten more dense, so you have to transmit less distance. They have gotten more crowded and noisy as well. It's a separate issue, but they've gotten closer to you most of the time. And we've switched to lower power and faster protocols. Like the old analog phones had to use a ton of power to reach some tower that was 30 miles away because there weren't a whole lot of them. These days we have these nice fast digital networks that are much, much lower power on the transmit side. And as the networks get faster, it's like the race to sleep thing on CPUs. You can, like, you know, keep the radio on for a shorter time, transmit more data, and then be done and go back into sleep.
Yeah, but like what I'm thinking of it is that, you know, eventually it will become the limiting factor because the other parts can progress at sort of the pace of technology, but the radio parts can only progress at the rate of infrastructure. You know, like how long does it take to build out new towers, to convert the networks, to do all that? That moves so much more slowly, and if current trends continue, that will become the dominant factor in power use. Whereas right now, it's not the dominant factor. The dominant factor now is if you have some app that's running in the background all the time, it will kill your phone before it gets a chance to waste all its energy on talking to cell phone towers, right, to get data. But I think by the time our kids grow up, that especially given the way the infrastructure, the glacial pace that infrastructure changes over in the U.S., that talking to the cell network will be the dominant power source. If we're lucky, I guess. I mean, I guess they could continue to do what you were just saying, which is like, well, they never spend their energy on better battery life. They always spend it on better features and CPU speed and stuff and just maintain parity in battery life. And thinking about that with my dumb phone, I almost think that multi-day battery life is a little bit of a curse as well as a blessing because I forget to charge my phone because it lasts like 6.5 days on a charge, right?
Yeah.
And if you have to charge your phone every day, if you have 18 or 20-hour battery life, you're probably okay. But once you get like 50-hour battery life, now you forget to charge your phone.
Yeah, that's true actually, because like that's how I was with Kindles when I used them more. E-ink Kindles is like I would not charge my Kindle ever, and most of the time it wasn't a problem. One day of every 2 months, maybe I'd go to read and I couldn't because it was dead, so I'd plug it in, and then I wouldn't care for 2 more months.
Yeah. I mean, that's the extreme case. I think that is acceptable. But with my phone, my wife was always complaining because my phone's not charged. And why is it not charged? Because I don't need to charge it every day or every other day, every 3 days. Like, seriously, like maybe once a week I need to charge it. But I need to like remember, it's not once a week. It's like every 5.5 days or something. So,
yeah, I don't know. It's interesting to me trying to pick out what is the obvious downfall of stuff today. And the other thing that we haven't really mentioned that I wonder is, will home broadband still be a thing? And I'm not sure, because if you think about it, as I've said numerous times on this show, LTE, even in reasonable speeds, is quicker than my broadband at home 5 years ago. And granted, 5 years is a long time, but LTE at burst, like ridiculously awesome speeds, is almost as quick, if not in some rare cases as quick as my beloved Fios today. And granted, Marco, you have the super baller Fios, but for us regular humans, it's almost on par. And if it wasn't for bandwidth limits, then there's an argument that maybe we wouldn't need home internet. And I keep thinking back to like AOL and back when you would have a limited amount of minutes. You were talking about this on the talk show, when you had a limited amount of minutes and it was like $3,000 a minute to be online. And then eventually everything became unlimited, because even ISPs had that, if memory serves, or a lot of ISPs took that approach of it's timed and you only get so much time a month and so on. Mm-hmm. But eventually it was a race to, I don't know if the bottom's the right way of phrasing it, but it was a race to unlimited. And I wonder if the cell phone companies will eventually race to unlimited, kind of like what Sprint is supposedly doing. And I don't know. I mean, there are places where that won't work, of course, where you're in the middle of nowhere. But actually, I have some friends at work that do live in the middle of nowhere, and the quickest internet they can get is a Verizon MiFi, or perhaps just make their phone a hotspot, because the only other option they have is DSL. So sometimes, in some certain circumstances, being in the middle of nowhere, that makes cellular internet the best option.
I think that's even in the even more distant future, because anyone who writes a sci-fi book doesn't involve like wires going to people's houses. The sci-fi book, like the super fast network that connects all the computers on the super advanced planet, is always wireless, right? And I think the main thing that will make that happen for us is the inability of us to do infrastructure projects in this country in a reasonable amount of time. Because running wires to everybody's house, it seems beyond the capabilities of any private company or government, or the combination thereof, because it's some big combination of eminent domain for the wires and the people owning the existing things and stuff like that. So given that incredible screwed upness, it's ripe for wireless to get good enough and say, we don't need to do that stuff. We don't need to dig trenches and run wires and deal with the government and stuff. We just need to, I guess they still need to deal with the government for the spectrum. But assuming they can make use of the spectrum that's already available, that they already have, that's definitely ready for it to happen. But, and it seems more sci-fi like, but I think if it wasn't for our complete inability to run wires to people's houses in a reasonable fashion, that the wired would still maintained its hold, because as fast as wireless is ever going to get, again, unless you go with some crazy quantum entanglement, super advanced sci-fi thing, if you have the technology to do that, think of the technology you have for the wireless. And even though you can't think of a use for 100 times faster than LTE now, or 1,000 times faster, if you had it, you would come up with the uses for it. Like, it's not going to be 8K television, but who knows? It'd be like holograms or neural imprint. We're talking far future or whatever. So,
maybe.
I think wireless is inevitable for us because of our inability to run wires. But I think if everything was on an even keel, and you could get the wires to people's houses, that would continue to be a thing, just because it's so much more capable.
Well, but wireless has a pretty big problem where it has the ceiling at which it slams into limitations of spectrum and space and density, where wires can run in a very, very dense area, in a very dense arrangement, and doesn't really affect them. It doesn't really matter that much. They have some challenges at some of the big, bottleneck piping points of the backhaul, but not major problems. And most of the time, that can also be solved by just running more wires. Whereas if you're in like a dense city area and the radio spectrum is just jammed full, and it's still not enough capacity, and there's no more spectrum to be had that's available in the area for a while or ever. That's a problem. Like, you hit this hard ceiling with wireless.
Well, but wireless is a wired system. Like, in cities, wireless is a wired system. All you're getting rid of is that the last mile, they call it, but in an apartment building, it's that last 200 feet, because your cell tower could be connected by a fiber optic cable to some backbone or whatever. It's just that your house isn't connected to the cell tower by any kind of cable. You connect to the cell tower, you know what I mean? Like, especially in cities where your building would have some kind of cell tower in it, but your building would be wired to the backbone. So it's just getting rid of that last mile. But what it means is that you don't have to have some wire to your house that you pay for, that you're paying for this amorphous service that exists everywhere in the air. I think that's what Casey's getting at. Like, when he says broadband goes away, you mean a thing I pay for that goes to my house. Instead, you're just going to pay for access to the air over the entire country, and you're not paying for that one wire to your house. But the wires are all still going to be there. It's just a question of how dense can you get the towers and stuff like that. And that's and what Marco was saying about the limitations. Yeah, that's why having a wire going to your house, or not a wire, but like a fiber optic thing or whatever, it's always going to win. Like, it's better to not have to send signals through the air, right? You'll have much more capacity there. Just the question is, is the difficulty of running those wires to people's houses going to make it so that wireless just comes in and disrupts them, old-fashioned disruption? Like, while you guys are busy over there arguing about cable packages and fiber optic and last mile crap, we're just going to offer this for everybody for free. They're already paying for it, and we're going to say, hey, it's good enough to be your broadband, ditch everything, and we win.
Yeah, I mean, I think it matters more in rural areas where you already have issues getting high-speed cable and high-speed DSL, and certainly fiber is out of the question in rural areas where wireless covers them way more easily by area. So it's going to be, I think, a lot like having well water from the city pumped to you versus having to pump your own water, or having natural gas pipeline to your house rather than having to use liquid propane. Like, there's going to be the city hookups, like the main infrastructure hookups are probably always going to be better if you can get them. But the advantage is that you don't have to get them in a lot of places. And wireless has started covering rural areas much more slowly than cities, but it's covering them, more slowly than you can get LTE in Manhattan, but a lot faster than you can get Fios in the rural areas,
Yeah. Although I want to go back a step. John, you had made mention that there will be some new thing like 4K TV or maybe even holograms that will necessitate a really fat pipe coming into your house. But I don't know. I mean, I remember vividly trying to download an MP3 from some weirdo FTP site that was surely installing 1,000 viruses on my Windows PC. And I remember doing this over dial-up and thinking to myself, I can tell, even as a teenager at the time, I can tell that this is not going to be as painful in the future. And then once it got to the point that I could download an MP3 with some modicum of a quickness, then I would try to download a video. And I could tell, this is going to get a lot better in the future. And I think that, maybe you're right, that maybe there'll be a hologram or something like that. But I don't know.
I was saying that's silly. Like, it's not going to be like, increasingly high resolution video. That's a silly extrapolation of what we have now. But if you want to take something that we have now that will get worse in the future, that already needs more capacities, and we talk about it all the time, it's backups. And not from a backup perspective, but just like, if you produce all this digital content in your life, this video you create, the pictures you take, that's only going to get bigger up to a point, because it's the point where if you're taking 4K videos on your cell phone, it probably doesn't need to be much better than that, maybe twice as good or whatever. But over a lifetime, you will build up a lot of that. And I still think it's ridiculous to make people accept that stuff could go away at any time and you don't really own it and it just disappears. So if there was some way to sort of like, again, I get back to the transporter ad, if there was sort of this series of little devices at home, at work, at all your friends' house, and your data could be pushed among it so that when your house burned down, you know you wouldn't lose all your data. Like, that's the ultimate extension of the internet. But to do that, you need massive bandwidth between all these nodes. So, how is it feasible to move a lifetime worth of information amongst these nodes in real time? Like, can I move video as fast as I can grab it on my phone? Of course you can't. But if you have these gigantic pipes going to and from your house, many interesting things are happening. That's why I think, like, we don't need 10,000 times the bandwidth we have. But if you go to someone, okay, picture that you have 10,000 times the bandwidth. Can you think of something you can do with that? Those type of numbers, like order of magnitude increases, open up things to the realm of possibility that were not even a twinkle in anyone's eye, but you're like, okay, boom, you have it. Now what can you do? And like, that's, downloading video over the internet to watch movies in high def. If you had proposed that to someone in 1962, they would have probably thought of that. They would have said, wow, if I have that kind of bandwidth, I can send moving pictures to, and lo and behold, you can. And like, how did we get from point A to point B? It's not like you need to build this network because we can send movies. And it's not like, well, we need to send movies, so you need to build this network. They kind of go hand in hand. But data backup and moving all your personal data amongst this big cloud, that would require massive bandwidth.
We'll have to rethink cities.
that to me is the best example.
Yeah, and if we all had segways, that would be
right.
I got that reference, Marco.
No, I think that makes the most sense. The backups makes the most sense because that's something that you're right. I can tell today that that's too slow, and it shouldn't be that slow, and it probably won't be.
But we wouldn't call it backups like that. It would not be a backup. That would be the up. It would be the up that we're backing. Like there is no backup. It's just like of course, all our information is just there. And of course it is redundant and separated and travels with us and synchronized between these things. And whether it's because we buy these little, thumb-sized transporter type things and spread them around, or whether there's some sort of cloud storage solution that somebody does, like this wad of data that we already each make this wad of data. It's too big for us to do anything with. We can barely have one primary location and then one like backup that we put it to, let alone having it instantly synchronized everywhere. It's just, there's not enough bandwidth for that. And we've talked about it many times before. And that's just with current generation video and current stuff. And algorithms will increase, but then I think solar resolution will increase a little bit more. And think of people who have a lifetime of this stuff versus people who started taking high def video in 2007. How about people who start taking high def video in 2007 and they're 8 years old and they do it for their entire life? How much data are they going to have by the end of it? Maybe they don't want to keep it all, but it seems like you're going to want to keep some of it somehow.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, and before we leave this topic, I want to get back to the easy one that none of us picked for Casey saying, what's going to look weird to our kids? The easy one that I don't know if is not worth even mentioning is that, of course, all our crap is going to look humongous and ridiculous. Like, of course it is. The same way when you look at, like, full-height hard drives or your full-height tower PC case or, like, even our Mac Pro cheese graters eventually when we get used to these Mac Pros, everything's going to look gigantic. It's like, you carry this around? Like, I have a Newton on my desk now. My Newton looks ridiculous next to my iPod Touch, right? Of course that's going to happen with everything. Laptops, phones.
Well, will it?
Yeah, I'm not so sure.
Laptops and phones have both reached the point, and not even recently, they've both reached the point where they're pretty much, like, as small as they can be and still have the screen size that they have, and in the case of laptops, still have like the keyboard size that they have. Like there's not a whole lot of room to make them a lot smaller and still keep those keyboards.
If your iPhone 5 looked exactly like it does, but it was the thickness and weight of a credit card, your current iPhone 5 would look ridiculous compared to it.
That's true, but we're talking about such a small scale. Like the differences are so much smaller, and some parts of computing have gotten bigger. I mean, look how small that original Mac looks. It turns out things that are good to get bigger, we've gotten bigger.
Well, that's like screen size. Like, even if you just look at the thickness of my 23-inch Apple Cinema display in front of me now compared to the thickness of an iMac, which has a whole computer behind it, that is thinner than my monitor. And it doesn't have to be that big of a deal. If I compare my current iPod Touch to the first generation iPod Touch, that looks ridiculous, and the difference is like 2 millimeters. But you put it in your hand, you're like, oh, how did you ever use this iPod Touch? It's like, twice the thickness of it's not that big of a difference, but that tends to be glaring to people in retrospect how big and thick and heavy things were.
No, I think that's a good point, but I think that Marco's also right that in terms of width and height, I'm not sure that most devices are going to get that much smaller. I think you're absolutely right that in terms of depth, they will get smaller.
Well, I mean, look at the Newton Message Pad has a small, it's probably similar screen size to an iPad mini, but way thicker and heavier. And so that's what stands out. It's not so much that like the width and height, it's different proportions than an iPad mini, but the area is similar. But it's because it's like a brick, then you feel like, oh, well, it feels old.
And it's funny. This is a bit of a tangent, but from our tangent of a tangent of a tangent of a tangent. But
on this show,
yeah, exactly. I got for Christmas the Apple leather case, a black one for my iPhone 5S, and I didn't typically. I had a bumper on my 4S for a long time. Probably at least half the time I had the 4S, and I liked it, but I mean, it wasn't my favorite. But I didn't trust myself not to have a case at all, which I don't really argue is the better way to go. And I wanted to try the leather case for the 5S because I felt like it would be a really nice compromise. It didn't seem to add that much thickness, and it seemed to be pretty nice. And I've had it since Christmas, like I said, and I actually really, really like it a lot. And it's the first real case I've ever had, not a bumper or anything like that. And I really, really, really like it. I got the black one, so as it fades, if it's faded, I can't tell. But it doesn't add that much thickness, which is what made me think of it. Or I don't feel like it adds that much thickness. Having come from a 4S not that long ago, it doesn't add enough thickness to make it feel like it's ruined the phone. And I really, really like mine. Now, I'm not saying that a case is right for you, Marco, and I know, John, you don't believe in iPhones for yourself, but I do really like it.
I often wonder why it seems. I mean, is it just me? And saying this as somebody who doesn't buy a lot of cases, is it just me, or is there basically no competition for Apple's cases for the iPhone and iPad in how small and thin and light they tend to be, and also how high quality they tend to feel and look? Like, it seems like every other case I've seen, there are high quality ones, but they're substantially bulkier, and all the ones that are super small and thin are like silicone thick crappy things that just feels like crap and looks like crap.
Marco, how quickly we forget the iPad 1 case.
Oh, well, that was a disaster.
Or the current like non-leather wrap around the back of the iPad cases. Those are not good either.
I have one, and actually, I don't particularly care for the one on the iPad Mini. In fact, I take it off quite often just while I'm using the iPad because the damn magnet that holds it to the back of the iPad is nowhere near strong enough. I feel like, John, you've said this in the past. Somebody has said this in the past, but
having the cases be minimal, though, I'm not sure if there's much competition, for example, for the leather one. And I think a lot of that is because I think people like big. They want to feel like they're spending money on something like a big case. Like, it seems like if you're going to get a case, you want to feel a case, and if you buy something and it's barely there, then you don't feel like you're getting anything. So maybe that's why in the third party is there more of a market that. But I mean, you've seen my iPod Touch case, right? And everyone who sees the iPod Touch case takes a double take to think, does this have a case on it yet, or is this what the back of the iPod Touch is like? And it's just a run-of-the-mill Belkin plastic case. But because the iPod Touch is so incredibly thin, with the case on, it feels like almost like there's no case there. And it's very tightly fitting, and it's not made of some loosey-goosey material and stretchy around the edges and everything, and the buttons, line up with all the things and feel nice when you're pressing them. In that way, like the leather case. It made me think of, because my wife's got the red leather case for her 5S. In the same way where you're like, well, you're pushing buttons through the case or whatever, it can be done reasonably well. And I think there are case makers who do sort of compete in that realm, if only on the iPod Touch in this case. But I bet there's something out there for the 5S as well. But mostly when I see people with cases, they are comical and huge, and people love them. People love them.
Although I will say very quickly, the Achilles heel of this case is absolutely the lock button. The lock button feels considerably more mushy than it did when it was caseless.
You mean the ring silent button?
Yeah, the one at the top.
The sleep wake button.
Whatever. It feels a lot mushier. And I was told, and I think it's true, that it would get better over time, and it has gotten somewhat better over the last month or so, but it's still not as crisp as I would like.
Oh, you mean the power button?
The sleep wake button.
Whatever. The one on the top. The one on the top.
I'm thinking of the one because the one on the side, they have a cutout for it. You stick your fingernail in there and you switch it to ring. That's what I was talking about. That one is actually, they don't cover up because I guess they couldn't. It wouldn't make any sense. But yeah, the squishiness of the button on top, you're right. It doesn't quite fit. Like in that case, I think my cheap Belkin case from my iPod Touch feels better because it's more of a positive kind of click because it's a material with less squishiness than leather. Leather itself is going to give, so it's harder for them. That's why I think they should have made a leather case but with like metal through buttons. That would have been really nice and high quality, right?
I agree.
Then it would have cost $80
Probably.
or $90, whatever. I don't even know how much it costs. I don't want to know.
The leather case, it was a gift, but I want to say it was $40 or $50. I think something like that. I don't remember. It was expensive enough that I didn't want to buy it for myself, and it would to me that's the perfect gift. It's where it's something that you want, but you don't really think you want to spend your own money on it. And of course, you could take this as a terrible thing. Oh well, why don't you buy it for me instead? But it's like that's the perfect gift because it's something you know you want, but it's not something you necessarily want to buy for yourself. But man, if somebody else buys it for you, that's awesome.
Well, the best thing would be if your wife buys it for you with your shared pool of money. Because then what have you done? Nothing.
Yeah,
You're just like this crazy mental game you're playing with yourself.